Absolute versions of Wonder Woman and Batman will also be meeting up in her book. So that's the first, like, hero crossover that's going to be happening. That's not the only thing that the Absolute comic is crossing over with, because apparently it's already crossing over with the regular line Superman book. I just learned this because I was reading Superboy Prime's Wikipedia page the other day, and I saw a note at the very end of his history. Superman and the Time Trapper enlist Superboy Prime to battle the Legion of Superheroes of the Absolute Universe. The Absolute Universe is already crossing over into the mainstream DC universe now. And it's in a Superman book? And Superboy Prime is a part of it? What? What is happening? Also, looking at the pages, it sets up the next Crisis. That's what this is building up to, seemingly. I thought that the crossover between Absolute and the mainstream DC universe was going to be bigger than this, although this is, these are little stepping stones to get to that point. I'm sure over the next couple months it'll be building up more and more, but I imagine that that's going to be some spectacle to behold, is when these two places finally cross over. Darkseid comes back to reap vengeance on the main DC universe. Fucking things go bad. Absolute DC continues. DC mainstream universe gets a crisis, and they get to do some new stuff, I guess. But this got me thinking about DC Crises, because Death Metal, which was like the last major one that I thought had happened, was barely 4 to 5 years ago. And then I started looking into it, and I realized that there was something called Dark Crisis that I totally forgot about. And that was barely 3 years ago. I did some research. I did some math about this DC Crisis. Because like I said, this book, it's a wink and a nod thing. It doesn't seem like it happens much. I haven't read Superman 28. Not yet, at least. I guess I'll check it out because it has Superboy Prime, and I kind of like him as a character. But he literally winks at the camera. He's like, sounds like there's a crisis at hand, wink. It's that kind of thing. So they're building up to an absolute crisis. And it's that fact that I had totally forgotten about Dark Crisis happening barely 2 years ago. And they're already alluding to a new crisis, not just in the Superman book, but in Justice League Unlimited from Mark Waid. Literally references in the text the end of the universe and a crisis during a hyper time segment. I had to go back and look just to see, because it seems like it's getting ridiculous how often DC is rebooting under Crises. And here's what I found. Crisis on Infinite Earths to 0 Year. Crisis on Infinite Earths began in 1985, ended in 86 in March. 0 Year began and ended September of 1994. That was a total of 8 years between. 0 Year to Infinite Crisis, 94 September to December 2005. 11 whole years post 0 Year, pre-Infinite Crisis. Now here's where things get ridiculous. In only their third official crisis, Infinite Crisis to Final Crisis, just under 2 years of time pass. Final Crisis to Flashpoint. That seems like a pretty big span of time, right? Like, it seems like they had established quite a bit of things to then undo everything in Flashpoint. No, it was barely 2 years. Final Crisis ended January 2009. Flashpoint began May 2011. Flashpoint to Convergence. Remember Convergence? 3.5 years of time between those. And then, this is where it gets even more ridiculous. From Convergence, Dark Knight's Metal, that is only 2 years. But that's not all, because the other major Crisis event, because I guess Metal is a crisis, as is Doomsday Clock. At least they wanted it to be. Doomsday Clock and Dark Knight's Metal overlap for 5 months. And then Doomsday Clock continued for another year after Dark Knight's Metal. But nobody liked Doomsday Clock, so they ignored it. And then Dark Knight's Death Metal came out 5 months and 29 days after Doomsday Clock ended. Then you get Dark Knight's Metal to, I guess, Generations. Remember that, because not many people do. Which was a 4-month overlap in time and continued for a month and 23 days. They wanted to treat Generations like an all-new era when Dan DiDio was still there, but then they undid that. because he got fired. So then we get Generations to Dark Crisis. 1 year and 2 months between time. So in conclusion, here's the list of time. Crisis on Infinite Earths to 0 year, 8 years. 0 year to Infinite Crisis, 11 years. That's pretty good. Infinite Crisis to Final Crisis, just under 2 years. Final Crisis to Flashpoint, 2 years. Flashpoint to Convergence, 3.5 years. Convergence to Dark Knight's Metal, 2 years. Dark Knight Metal, Doomsday Clock, let's just say a year. Doomsday Clock to Death Metal, less than a year. Death Metal Generations, fucking who cares at this point. Generations to Dark Crisis, 1 year and 2 months. Making the average rate of DC Crises 3.4 years per interval. About every 3.4 years, on average, there is a comic book crisis at DC Comics. And based on this average rate, that means that their next crisis will be around September of 2025. And what's that? Oh, look at this nice image that DC Comics published a while ago. Legion of Darkseid is ending in September of 2025 with a mysterious Omega symbol in fall 2025. I wonder if this has something to do with the crisis that is being discussed in Justice League Unlimited and Superman 28. All of this is to say that it is ridiculous how often DC is like, I don't like how we're doing, let's retry it. Get a crisis going. And it seems as time progresses, there's less and less reason to do that. Because they kind of just carry everything over and don't really bother to try anything too new or different. Because, like, what did Dark Crisis change? It didn't reboot the universe, did it? It just expanded some stuff and, like, changed some things around, if that. But maybe this new DC Crisis that should be expected sometime this fall, according to my calculations, will be a true crisis. Because we really haven't had one since, like, Flashpoint, really. Everything else has just kind of been, it just kind of continues onwards. Like, oh, that was weird. Let's keep on keeping on. And I expect this upcoming crisis to be something along the lines of Absolution. DC's Absolute Crisis. Absolution Crisis. Crisis of Absolutions. I don't know. But here's something neat that I learned. And that is something called Absolute Infinite. Doesn't that sound right up DC's alley for a crisis? It is an idea proposed by mathematician George Cantor, who also identifies the absolute infinity with God. And what did he use for absolute infinity? What symbol could he have possibly chosen? The Omega symbol! It is perfect. DC, if you... I'm not gonna read it probably, but if you need a name for your next crisis and you don't use Absolute Infinity Crisis or Absolute Infinite Crisis, what are you doing? It's wasted potential right there. And thus ends my tyrannical rant about DC and Absolute and Crises and whatnot. I feel like I just embodied Psycho Pirate or something.